The only thing is, I did my presentation before I saw Jeff, so unfortunately, it's kind of scary how much review that this is going to be. I thought it was new material, but it won't be. But earlier, I argued that the nature of the heavens and earth created in Genesis must match the nature of the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21 and 22. As Hebrews 1:10 says, that which God created in the beginning passes away at the end. And so the nature of the end, whatever you define that, even in traditional terms it works. The nature of the end tells us what the nature of the beginning is, for the end is merely the end of the beginning of what God created in the beginning. Does that make sense? We're talking about a big story here. Beginning and end have to match. Now what I want to do with this presentation is go to the next step. Not only must the nature of creation and new creation match, but the nature of the original curse must also match the nature of the original creation described in Genesis. Or to put it another way, it's textually indefensible to say that Genesis creation is all about the formation of the physical universe, and then come up with and read the curse and say that we're talking about a spiritual curse in Genesis 3, because you've switched gears. You've gone from a physical universe view of creation to a non-physical curse. What we see in the biblical story, and this is what I'm trying to point out here, is that God's curse falls on what God created. We have cursed cattle, cursed pain in childbirth, for example, a ground curse, thorns and thistles, sweat, and return to dust. So however you take that, the curse is related to the nature of the creation. So let's go ahead and read this. Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle. So right there we see that the cattle is cursed. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow in your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And I believe that sets the scene, the context, for the resurrection, in which, according to Daniel, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Do you see the theme of dust right there? Daniel's working from the context of creation and the curse specifically, and it's a resurrection from that dust to which Adam returned, and that tells us an awful lot about the nature of the resurrection. The resurrection is life from the death of Adam. So what I want to ask you here as you think about this is, how is it possible to pick and choose our way as preterists primarily? And I'm speaking primarily to preterists here. How can we pick and choose our way through the account? And here's the problem. If it's a material creation being described in Genesis 1 and 2, then how can we possibly avoid a material view of the curse? Because in the biblical story, the curse falls on what God created. That's the way the story works out as we get even into the New Testament. Or to put another way, if the curse is covenantal death, I'm thinking in terms of preterism here, not physical death, then it is covenant creation in Genesis 1 and 2. Creation and curse are deeply related in essence. They have to match in their nature. And by highlighting the inescapable link between creation and curse, I hope to convince those who already embrace a fully covenant view of God's curse and the fall, whether old earth creationists or full preterists, to be consistent and accept a fully covenantal view of creation. And what I want to do in this presentation is I want to show how Noah's flood fits into this covenant context that I sort of hinted at with that first presentation. Now, before I get into those presentations, I guess we can call it merely review now. Covenant creation, this is sort of interesting. Covenant creation actually fits into this wider dialogue about the Genesis debate that's going on about Genesis. Many believe, the popular understanding is that the Genesis debate is about the age of planet Earth. And the more I study, the more I get into this, the more I'm really realizing that's not the case really fundamentally at all. We tend to think of it as simple as lining up all the old earthers on one side, All the young earthers are on the other side, and they go at it. Right? That's the Genesis debate. That's the way we think of the Genesis debate. That's the way I've thought about the Genesis debate for too long. The whole truth is a little more complicated because there is that third dimension to the debate. And Jeff introduced to you the concepts of concordism and non-concordism. There's another group out there, and they're actually getting more vocal, who are called non-concordists. And Jeff explained what that means. They do not believe that the text matches up or concords with a physical description in scientific terms of the origination of the universe. And covenant creation is a non-concordist view. That's really what I'm talking about this weekend. I think some of the other speakers have been talking about it as well. It's a non-concordist view, but there are other non-concordist views as well, including framework, ancient Near East, revelatory days, and local creation views, like, for example, Dr. Sailhammer. And these views are actually growing right now as young Earth creationists' views are kind of on the wane. You're seeing non-concordists come up. There's a new book out by Glover. What's it? Beyond the Firmament? That's really presenting more ideas here in terms of a non-concordist view of creation. So if you characterize the debate in concordist versus non-concordist terms, you're going to see interesting allies and agreements that come together with views that you think of as opposed to one another. Because really what you think, when you think about concordism versus non-concordism, young Earth views agree with day age and gap theory views at a very fundamental level. They agree, as Jeff was explaining, that the text of Scripture matches up with a scientific description of the origination of the universe. And they're all debating, of course, what those details mean. So you have gap guys, and you have day age guys, and you have young Earth creationists. They're all in agreement fundamentally about what the text is about and how it's communicating, even though they disagree with the details. So actually, they're all in the same camp in the wider scheme of things. Those concordist views are really pitted against, and I think this is where the Genesis debate is really going, against non-concordist views like those that I mentioned earlier. Here's where it gets pretty interesting, and Jeff beat me to it. The very same issue applies to issues of prophecy and eschatology. Because when you get right down to it, futurism at its root level, in its essence, of all different stripes, is a concordist view of Bible prophecy. It's a concordist view of eschatology. Because they're trying to match up prophecy in literal terms with the end of the physical universe. And it doesn't really matter if we're talking about postmillennialism or amillennialism or dispensationalism or any other panmillennialism or whatever. They're all concordist views. And really the only non-concordist view out there of prophecy and eschatology is preterism. It has a total monopoly of a non-concordist view of prophecy. And so I'm very excited because all these non-concordist views of Genesis creation are getting people ready to go where? To preterism. Because they have to be inconsistent, because these non-concordist views, once they start with, when you have non-concordist views and they start with Genesis creation, non-concordist sense, to remain futurist, they have to switch gears into a concordist view of prophecy. And I think they undermine their views of Genesis when they do that. Covenant creation is a non-concordist view of creation that matches covenant eschatology's non-concordist view of prophecy. And the only natural and consistent conclusion for a non-concordist view of creation, which is becoming more popular, is preterism on the other end of the Bible. So you guys out there who are working with the prophecy issue, this Genesis stuff is real important. I think it's going to pay some serious dividends in preter circles in the near future, hopefully. I would suggest that covenant eschatology is essential to the development of non-concordist views of creation because it's only preterism that tells us what creation is, what creation is all about. You know, if you read anything about the framework view or ancient Near East view or the revelatory days view or certain versions of the local creation view, you realize very quickly that they don't really have much to say about what creation is. They say a lot about what creation is not, and they make all these different arguments about what creation is not, but they don't give a positive explanation of what creation is. And so what you have, for example, you had the framework view that says, well, creation is a theologically oriented, non-sequential poetic statement. And I say, right, that's going in the right direction. But what is creation about? And framework kind of stops there. Of course, framework advocates are Reformed and they are also futurists. So they're kind of hung. They're hung up. They don't have the actual answer as to what is the subject of the poetry, what is being communicated in the theology, and why the non-sequential aspects that we see in the creation account. Ancient Near East says that it's a polemic. Creation is a polemic against the polytheistic idolatry. It's not an account of the origination of the physical universe, which I say, right, you're going in the right direction. But when you get right down to it, A&E does not tell you what Genesis 1 is really about. They see some parallels between ancient temple dedications, and they're getting close, they're getting warmer when they go that direction, but they don't really tell you what the focus of the account is all about. And the revelatory days view says that it's not creation days, as in the days that God took to create the physical universe, but the time which God revealed, the days that God revealed to Moses all these things. Or local creation is focused on the land of Israel, but a polemic against something, like polytheistic idolatry, is not a positive explanation of what the subject truly is. So, covenant creation actually says that. Covenant creation is all about this. Creation is about a covenant world, a temple dedication, a covenant order, a legal system. And that becomes a positive presentation. The old adage applies here. You can't beat something with nothing. So unfortunately, even though non-concordist views are growing, I think they're kind of going to be stunted until they get really the heart of this as far as what creation is about. And that's what makes covenant creation far superior to all non-concordist views. It emphasizes what creation, Genesis creation, is all about. It tells us as far as a framework, as far as what to expect from the text and what the point of the text is doing. This is all the covenant order by which God dwells with man in relationship, the heavens, earth, and sea. And non-concordist views of creation have to get that right if they're going to make superior big inroads into the culture, the Christian culture, which is right now dominated by young earth creationist views. And it's really, what it boils down to is only preterism tells us what God created in the beginning, the heavens and the earth, the old creation. Now the trouble is that non-concordist views, both creation and prophecy, are completely foreign to how modern Christians think about the Bible. We preterists run into this all the time with problems with translation. Don has been hinting at problems in translation, and we preterists know about that really well when it comes to New Testament prophecy and the time statements. What happens when we look at this issue in the New Testament? We find out that verb tenses get changed due to the bias of the translators. We find out that mello disappears just in the Greek text and it's gone. Okay? We find out that the end of the age becomes the end of the world. Right? Translation issues. We find out that the time of the end becomes the end of time, and we find out that explicit immediacy in the original text becomes a general doctrine of vague and perpetual imminence forever and ever. Right? Already but not yet. There's another great one. Yeah, it's tough. So, well, what's going on with those problems? Concordists are doing the translating, right? And so what they do is they take the concept of the physical universe that their presupposition is getting smuggled into the translations regardless of what the original text says. Now, this is nothing new for us. We know all about this. They really fudge the translations to salvage their physical universe and physical resurrection concepts of eschatology. Now, if that is happening in regard to the end, does it stand to reason that it might be happening in regard to the beginning? Let's just examine this and let's take a look. Wouldn't covenant creation be vindicated if the exact same problem and the exact same kinds of errors exist when the text deals with creation? I think that'd be a good way to strengthen the idea of covenant creation, if you could show the same kind of translation issues. So let's start with this example. from Hebrews 1:2, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. Hebrews 1:2 in the NIV. Pretty plain. I guess we're all done here. We can go home. Right? The universe, it says God created the universe. Covenant creation has been refuted. We're all done. What does the Greek actually say in that passage? Well, the New King James gets a little closer, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the worlds. Well, that's actually a little closer, but it sounds weirder. Worlds, plural? Yep, it's plural in Greek. At least they render the plural, but universe says would be a strange concept to find in the Bible. But the word is plural in Greek. What word is it there in reference to what God made? Remember, this is the same context as Hebrews 1:10-11, which says that what God created in the beginning was going to perish at the end. What underlies the Greek in Hebrews 1:2? Well, I might give it away by showing this related text from the King James Version, which should look very familiar to you. Disciples say to Jesus, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" in the King James. It's the same word. You, of course, see the problem with that passage. It's not the end of the world. It's the end of the age, the end of the aion. And that is precisely the word in the plural that we have in Hebrews 1:2. It says that God made the ages, the eons, through Jesus Christ. In fact, it is the exact same term in the Greek of this passage that from Paul. Now, all of these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Question: did the end of the universe come on Paul and in his day? No. But yet that's the exact same term in Greek as what is in Hebrews 1:2, where we find that God made the ages. Why aren't the translators consistent? Well, it's because they're thinking physical universe when they are translating Hebrews 1, because obviously we're talking about Genesis creation there. But they can see the obvious problem if Paul says that the end of the universe had come. I mean, there's an obvious problem there if Paul says that in his day. It's even stranger if the end of the universe says, plural, had come in his day. And so translators just naturally revert to the ages in English, and yet the exact same word eons in Hebrews 1:2, used for what God made, goes to universe. We have a real problem with translations here. And it's a very similar kind of problem as we find with prophecy in the New Testament. I'm not aware of any example in the New Testament where we have aeons as physical universe. And I'm going to talk about how this works out in consistency here in a second. But the simple assumption is that creation equals universe. And so when we get to Hebrews 1:2, the translators, instead of translating the Greek, they just put in universe. Here's another one. From Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Hebrews 11:3 in the NIV. Same problem. New King James renders it, by faith we understand that the worlds, plural, were formed by the word of God. Now there is no question in Hebrews 11:3 that the writer of Hebrews is referring back to Genesis creation, because he goes from there and he starts talking about the history of Abel and the history of all the rest of covenant history in chronological sequence. There's no doubt that he's talking about Genesis creation. And yet that text uses the same word as Hebrews 1:2, eons. God made the ages, and the writer of Hebrews associates this act with Genesis creation. So I want to challenge preterists here for a second to be consistent. If the end of the ages is not the end of the universe, then please tell me why the beginning, the creation of the ages, is the creation of the universe. Because I have a difficulty with seeing how that's consistent to switch gears from the creation of the universe to the end of the ages, which we all assume and argue against being the end of the physical universe. So I'm challenging preterists here to get consistent. I do not believe that 1 Corinthians 10:11 refers in any way to the historical end of the physical universe, then why would the creation of the ages describe the historical beginning of the physical universe? In other words, if the end is covenantal and doesn't have anything to do with the physical universe, then why isn't the beginning covenantal on the same terms? Challenged preterists here specifically. I believe that the book of Hebrews teaches covenant creation. And we have a difficulty here because of the translations, and the translators just choosing to smuggle in their own conceptions of a physical universe because that's what tradition says and that's what they expect to see. Now, keep in mind here that the wider context of the book of Hebrews was written to, well, Hebrews, right? So keep that context in mind, because in a moment we're going to see how this land theme works its way out across the Bible, and it comes up specifically in Hebrews. Let's go into another example of translation problems. This one really surprised me. There is another passage that translators completely botch, Psalm 107:3. Here's how it reads in the NIV. Let the redeemed of the Lord say this, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Well, what's wrong with that passage? You'd never know it in reading in English. What's wrong with that passage? Well, there is a footnote in the NIV which gives you a tip, but what's wrong with that passage? Well, in Hebrew, the word south does not exist. The translators substituted a totally different word in English than what appears in the Hebrew. They just changed it. South doesn't exist. What word is it in the Hebrew at the end there? The word is sea. The passage says God gathered the redeemed from the lands, from east and west, from north, and from the sea. Here's Young's literal. And from the lands hath gathered them, from east and from west, from north and from the sea. Now, given what I just did with my earlier presentation, can you see the structure of Genesis creation in that account? You see the threefold structure? The psalm works from a big theme in the Bible rooted ultimately in Genesis 1. God gathers his redeemed from the land, and I'm suggesting here that's Hebrews, and from the sea, Gentiles. And that's exactly what we see. This is a prophetic psalm of what comes to pass in the New Testament. God gathers both Hebrews and Gentiles. He redeems his whole creation at the end, including land and sea. And I submit that the directions listed in that psalm make perfect sense. If you get the translation right, it makes perfect sense. Think about the geographical orientation of Israel. Jerusalem and the temple were located in Judah in the south. And that's where the psalm starts. From east and west is a wall-to-wall reference of all Judah. And from the north, 10 tribes. Right? That's the 10 tribes up north. And from the sea, Gentiles. It makes perfect sense. But you would never know that because of the botched translation of the Hebrew translators. By the way, that psalm has many allusions to Genesis 1. I challenge you to read Psalm 107 sometime with the idea of creation in mind. And you're going to find out that all of these different themes come back up just as the same themes. They sat in darkness. Out of darkness they are called, verse 10. Verse 14 brings up the sea and the land. Verse 33, we talk about your numbers are increased, as in fulfilling the command and promise that God gave to man on the land and to the fish of the sea to increase, be fruitful, fill, and multiply. Well, there are dozens. Those are two examples of real problem translations that we have to deal with, but I think there are actually dozens more. And I think that it's going to take some covenant creation work to sort of find out where these problems are, because when you get it right, it works. And when you have bad translations, there's something just not right. So I take those two examples as a strong argument for covenant creation. Now, with that introduction, I'm ready to talk more about the curse and the flood in the covenant context of creation. And what I want to emphasize is that all creation is related to the curse and the flood. In fact, these three elements in Genesis are all related. And what I'm presenting here is not a radical position. I'm actually presenting the very same concept that young earth creationists are talking about. I believe they're right. So I guess this would be a good quote. Tim agrees with the young earth creationists. Consider this quote from Morris and Whitcomb. But there is a much closer connection between the biblical doctrines of the fall and flood than the mere fact that neither can be harmonized with uniformitarian views of Earth's history. Of course, I don't agree with that particular statement. Just follow his logic here. Follow the relationship between creation and the curse. The really important connection between them consists in the explanation which a universal flood provides for the laying down of the fossiliferous strata since the time of Adam. To put the issue in its sharpest delineation, a literal interpretation of the fall demands as its corollary a thoroughgoing biblical catastrophism, and the doctrine of the flood can be fully understood only in light of the fall and Edenic curse. You see, in young earth creationism, the global flood doctrine is the logical extension of their material biological curse. The flood explains why all the fossils which document physical death were laid down after Adam and the fall, and you see the global flood doctrine in Genesis 6 is just the extension of their view of the curse. Their biological view of the curse forces their view of the global flood, which becomes the explanation covering all of the fossils and the things that document death and destruction. But the young earth view says that God created a physical universe, God cursed the physical universe, and ultimately God is going to redeem the physical universe, and so they have this relationship going from beginning to end that all these things are related. And I think they're consistent. I see the young earth creationist view as consistent from Genesis to Revelation. According to Morris and Whitcomb and all the young earth writers, the nature of the creation, the nature of the curse, and the nature of the redemption all have to match, and that global flood view, like I said, covers over the evidence of biological death in the fossil record and how it got there after Adam's sin. Now, from my perspective, covenant creation totally agrees with the relationship that the young earth creationists are pointing out. It totally agrees that these things are all related, the creation, the curse, and the redemption. These things are totally related from Genesis to Revelation, and that's why I said at the beginning that it is textually indefensible to say that Genesis creation is a literal record about the formation of the physical universe, and then insist that the curse is just a covenantal or spiritual curse. Now, compare that view with old earth creationism. If I say that the Genesis 1 is talking about the physical universe, and then Genesis 3 is talking about a spiritual curse, which is the old earth creationist view essentially, and then the old earth creationists that I've read look forward to a new heavens and new earth, even though the curse never changed the physical world, we're still living in the same world physically that Adam had created, you've got a very chaotic system. It's going from the physical universe to a non-physical curse to a new physical universe to come. And that's why I believe that old earth creationism cannot, has not, and will not ever become very popular and very dominant in Christian circles. It's because the system is just chaos. Covenant creation and covenant eschatology is the solution. Because really, why young earth creationism, as we know it today, became very popular is they put together a system. They put together a reasonable, logical system. Physical universe was created in Genesis 1. We read it literally. Physical curse in Genesis 3. We read it literally. And physical redemption to come. We read it literally. Old earth creationists will never beat that. Because that is the better system. It's wrong, but it's the better system. And covenant creation and covenant eschatology is the solution. Here is another example of how young earth creationists get it right. Think carefully about what they're thinking about here as far as the logical connections. Uniformitarian paleontology assumes that uncounted billions of animals have experienced natural or violent deaths before the fall of Adam. But how can such an interpretation of the history of the animal kingdom be reconciled with the early chapters of Genesis? Does the book of Genesis, honestly studied in light of the New Testament, allow for a reign of tooth and claw and death and destruction before the fall of Adam? If not, we have further compelling reasons for questioning the uniformitarian scheme of reading the rocks, and at the same time a strong encouragement for finding in the great Genesis flood the true explanation for fossil formations in the crust of our planet. Now that quote reveals a few things. Note the assumption that creation is about the animal kingdom, right? That's the literal view of creation. That is concordism. God's curse falls on this entire creation and the animals and the entire planet, and is this creation that awaits the final redemption at the consummation, which we talk about Isaiah 65. It talks about animals laying down together. Violent animals are going to become pacifists again. They're not going to eat each other again. See, they take it all in the same system. It's all related. And they have a related view because they view the nature of creation and the curse and the redemption all on the same terms. And here's the irony. The ironic thing about that is that covenant creation is saying the same thing. You got to take them all in the same terms because they're all intimately related from Genesis to Revelation. The beginning and the end must match creation and curse and redemption. So, I want to take this advice and honestly study this issue in light of the New Testament, but also the Old Testament as well, and see if this is not demonstrable from the text itself. So let's go to covenant creation according to Isaiah. See if you find these statements familiar. As a woman with child and about to give birth, rise and cries out in her pain, so were we in your presence. Of course, we understand that Isaiah is talking about Israel. If you look at the context, it's very clear. So were we in your presence, O Lord. We were with child. We writhed in pain, but we gave birth to wind. We have not brought salvation to the earth. We have not given birth to people of the world. What is the prophet lamenting? Spiritual life. Israel had failed in their mission to bring life and light to the world. Isaiah presents the curse as upon Israel. Notice the reference to the land in that passage. Now follow the theme of the land and see as we continue. But your dead, Israel, speaking of Israel, will live. Their bodies will rise. You who dwell in the dust. This is coming from Adam's curse back in Genesis 3. Wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth, follow the earth and sea theme, Israel, will give birth to her dead. Isaiah is working from Genesis 3, but is the prophet talking about biological resurrection of physical bodies? I don't think so, because he actually uses the imagery of birth. Does that look familiar to you in New Testament theology? Birth. Futurists, of course, do not view resurrection in terms of birth, but here Isaiah presents resurrection in terms of birth. And I believe that this is a direct reference to the new birth, the resurrection of the corporate body of Israel. Resurrection here is from the death of the old covenant, from the dust, to the life of the new covenant, which also, of course, matches up with Daniel chapter 12. But let's continue. Go, my people, enter your rooms and shut the doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until his wrath passes by. Isaiah is prophesying about 586 BC and what was about to come with the destruction of Jerusalem. This is a covenant judgment on Israel when Jerusalem was destroyed. See, the Lord is coming out of his dwelling to punish the people of the earth, Israel, for their sins. The earth will disclose the blood shed upon her. Look familiar? Jesus used that reference in Matthew chapter 23. So upon you, this generation, will come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the righteous blood of Abel to Zechariah, I believe it. Yes, that's. Anyway, the text goes on, and watch this. In that day, time statement, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. You see how the text just switched context from land to sea? In a text about resurrection. The prophet says that God goes fishing with his sword. That's literally what it says, but what does it mean? I believe the prophet references the serpent and the great sea creatures which God created on day 5 of Genesis 1. In fact, the first place where Leviathan is mentioned in Scripture is in Genesis 1 with the creation of the sea creatures. They are Leviathan, creatures of the sea. So what we find out from the prophet is that when God judges the land, he will also judge the sea, both of whom were created by God in Genesis 1. The word for Leviathan here is the exact same word used for what God created, bara, in Genesis 1:21. And so I'm submitting to you here the connection from Isaiah 65, or Isaiah 24, that the sea creatures are people in the Old Covenant creation. They are Gentile nations. Believing Gentiles are in the outer courts of God's temple. We see that in the history of Israel. But watch what Isaiah does next. Where does he go next for this context? In that day, sing about a fruitful vineyard. From sea to land again, right? What day of creation is he talking about? He is referencing not only Isaiah 5 with the Song of the Vineyard, but also day 3 when God created the dry land to produce vegetation and bear seed-bearing fruit after its kind. So here we have sea and land both referenced in terms of judgment and resurrection in Isaiah 24, the very famous resurrection passage in the Old Testament. But let's continue. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it day and night. Another translation problem in Hebrew, it's night and day. Just like the pattern in Genesis 1. So that no one may harm it, I am not angry, if only there were briars and thorns confronting me. Briars and thorns, does that look familiar? All the way back from Genesis 3. And what we find here is that the thorns are wicked apostates in Israel. I would march against them in battle. I would set them all on fire, or else let them come to me for refuge. Let them make peace with me. Yes, let them make peace with me. How would the land make peace with God? In the fulfillment of this prophecy, the land would make peace with God through Messiah Jesus. How would the sea make peace with God? Through Messiah Jesus. Isaiah expounds on the creation account in his prophecy of the resurrection. And I don't believe that Isaiah reinterprets the creation account. I believe Isaiah is presenting it to us, the real meaning of what creation was all about. So does Jesus. Consider Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares as a story of Genesis creation rooted in Genesis, just like Isaiah's prophecy. We find in Matthew 13 that Jesus teaches the people, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came in and sowed weeds, tares, among the wheat. That's reaching back into Genesis creation. Because what we see in the creation account, God planted Adam and Eve on the land, and when Adam was sleeping on the job, who came in? An enemy came in, crept in, the serpent came in, and sowed weeds or thorns among the wheat. And the land began to produce wheat, the godly line of Seth, the sons of God, and tares, the wicked line of Cain, the sons of the evil one. Yet God allowed them to grow together until the end, according to the parable. That's the end of the Old Covenant creation. And again, we're not talking about the beginning of the universe or the end of the universe. We're not talking about literal wheat and tares. It's pretty obvious. The plants are people, right? The plants are people. And so we are talking about the beginning of the Old Covenant world, and then the harvest is the end of the Old Covenant world. It's all one story. And the parable of the wheat and the tares also has an uncanny connection to Joseph's dream back in Genesis 37. Because Joseph's dream was about two things. It was about shocks of wheat bowing down to Joseph, and the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to Joseph. And what do you find in Matthew chapter 13 with Jesus' parable of the wheat and tares? After he gets done, he says, after the harvest, God's people are going to shine like the sun. And so you have the wheat and the tares, and the heavenly bodies being referenced to God's people, God's redeemed people. This is Israel's history for the harvest at the end of the age was the same harvest that was decreed for Judah in places like Hosea 6:11. Remember, we're talking about the context here of land. When Jesus gives that parable of the land and the wheat and the tares, he's talking about the land context. This is the harvest of the land. But guess where Matthew goes next? In that very same passage, we find this parable next. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was laid down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. And so at the end, just as Isaiah foretold, God harvests not only his field, think day 3, the land, the productive land. But he also harvests the fish, the sea. And so you should think of the waters of Genesis 1 filled on day 5 with great sea creatures whom God created and God blessed. Jesus is really talking about the fulfillment of prophecies such as this. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to Englaim, where they will be places for spreading of nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. And in the parable, when these nets are brought up, the fish are separated out. Just like the sheep and the goats are separated out, just like the wheat and the tares are separated. So you have a harvest of the sea and the harvest of the land at the time of the resurrection. How often do we consider that the prophetic background in Ezekiel is what sets the context for why Jesus called his disciples and told them that he would make them fishers of men. Fishers of men. Their mission would be to the land. He sent them to the cities of Israel and to the sea. He sent them out to the sheep that were not of that sheep pen, to the Gentiles. So now you can understand why the book of Hebrews, written to a Jewish audience, provides this specific warning that originates back in Genesis 3. We find in Hebrews, land that drinks in the rain, context is land, often falling on it that produces a crop useful for those to whom it is farmed, receives the blessing of God. And I believe this is a reference to the righteous Jews who drank in the rain and believed God by receiving the Messiah. But land that produces thorns and thistles, echo from Genesis 3 curse, is worthless and is in danger of being cursed. In the end, it will be burned. See the context there? That's the book of Hebrews, talking to a Jewish audience. Yet other passages, such as Revelation 20, tell us that the judgment of the sea occurs at the same time as the judgment of the land. God's whole creation undergoes the judgment. God's whole creation undergoes the redemption through Messiah Jesus. Look how Paul puts it. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. Do you see people and creation placed side by side there? For the creation was subject to futility. That would be what God created in the beginning. Not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself, what God created in the beginning, will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation, Hebrew land, Gentile sea, groans and labors with birth pangs, think Genesis 3 again, big echo, together until now. Time statement. Paul said now. Paul did not say thousands of years from now. Paul said now, 2,000 years ago. We need to read Romans 8 in its wider context. This is the same the creation introduced in Romans 1:20, which revealed God to these Jewish men who suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. And some predators have done some great work on the covenant context of Romans chapter 1. And those who gave up the glory of God and suppressed the truth in righteousness, those are statements that are coming from the prophets who were given to Israel. And it was the unbelieving Jews who gave up the glory of God and exchanged them for idols, etc. If you can look back at Hosea and other places in the prophets. Israel knew God. Paul's audience is primarily Jewish. And so we should think back to Genesis 1:17. God set the lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light to the earth. Israel was given the worship system to know God. They were given light. The light was for the land, for the earth. The Old Covenant creation taught Israel about God. And that's really the source and context for Paul's teaching in Romans 1 and 8. Paul reaches back into the creation that originates in Genesis 1 through 3. He uses all the same language and same imagery from Genesis 1 through 3. And that was the creation that was subjected to futility and groaned and labored. That would be the curse on Adam. With birth pains, curse on Eve, until then, Paul's day. Question. Is Paul taking original creation and redefining it in an entirely new way that it's never been done before? Or is he expositing the nature of creation and curse as it had always been? What is the creation according to Paul? The creation is not the physical universe. And we see the same thing in Psalm 102, a creation psalm that is talking about God's people, and Psalm 107. The creation is, according to Paul, God's people, just like the new creation is God's new people. See, here's the problem. If we assume Genesis creation was meant as a description of the physical universe, then Paul has commandeered Genesis creation in a way it was never intended to be. And yet, Paul claimed his gospel was promised beforehand in Romans 1:2. Paul claimed he taught only what the law and prophets taught in places like Acts 24:14 and Acts 26:22. And so I will put it plainly. If Paul is talking about the physical universe, he is a liar. Because he's redefining creation in an entirely new way. Paul is describing the original context of creation. That creation groaned in the birth pains. That creation groaned under futility until his day. Paul exposits Genesis creation in its own original context, and that shows how a covenant end, a covenant curse, and a covenant resurrection demands covenant creation. That big picture prepares us for a little comment about the flood in covenant context. What was destroyed by the flood? You know, Jeff and I argued in our book that there was a covenant context to the flood related to the line of Seth. And so you have this genealogy of Seth, and you have this insertion of the flood narrative into that genealogy. And so that gives us, right there from Genesis 5, a context and a sort of a way of understanding the flood in terms of the line of Seth. Well, does Genesis say that the sea was destroyed in the flood? No. Genesis declares that the dry land was destroyed by the flood. Every living thing on the dry land that had the breath of life in it, and that's the same description of Adam, man on the land, representing a Hebrew context, in its nostrils died. There is no mention of sea in the entire flood account. And this is sort of interesting. If you look at creation ministries, this is sort of an issue that they kind of never really deal with. Can you imagine mixing all of the fresh water in the world with all the salt water? Do you have any idea what that would do to specialized niche environments in the ocean? Well, we don't have to worry about that because the Bible doesn't say anything about the sea in the flood account. It was the land and those that had the breath of life in their nostrils that died. And, of course, his creatures, his kingdom. God destroyed the land he made on day 3, and this is a specific portion of the creation of Genesis 1, not the entire heavens and earth of Genesis 1. I would add that these details are important because it shows, first of all, that the flood was local. If you take it as a historical account, which I do, it's a local flood. But the land is symbolic of a covenant jurisdiction, the people who were given the knowledge of God. Remember, light to the earth. The sun, moon, and stars are given for light for the earth. That would be Seth's line, who called on the name of the Lord. And consider how that matches with Peter's discussion about the flood. For this they, that is the scoffers, the Jewish unbelievers who asked, where is this guy who claimed he was coming, willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Pay attention to the detail in Peter's text. He's talking about a specific portion of Genesis 1 being deluged by water. The earth came up out of the water. To what portion of creation does Peter refer? He refers to day 3 when God made the land. And what's interesting here again, every commentary I've ever consulted says Peter's talking about Genesis 1. particularly the creation of the land in day 3. And that land was submerged by water and destroyed. So here we have this reference, this covenant context, even in Peter's view of the flood coming to the forefront, and you can see it by the way he phrases exactly what he says. Peter says that the heavens were of old, and the flood destroyed the land. The only land that survived is Noah's family, who entered into special covenant relationship with God, just like Israel did. The sea is completely beyond the purview of the story. That context prepares us for the covenant after the flood. Note how the detail works in God's promise to Noah. As long as the earth endures, time statement, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Again, no mention of sea here. There's no mention of sea. What's going on with this covenant with Noah? God is reaffirming the created order related to the land that was first inaugurated in Genesis 1. And as we saw earlier, the creation of the old heavens and the old earth set up a covenant or legal order. And Don actually just pointed out how you have some similarities between the creation account in Genesis 1 and Noah, the story of Noah after the flood. The whole flood story sort of mimics or models or echoes the creation account in certain interesting ways. Seed time and harvest match the seasons ordained in the Old Covenant economy from the very beginning. The feast in the worship calendar match the changes in the year. Cold and heat refers to God's blessing and judgment on His people during the Old Covenant creation. Day and night matches the order of daily temple worship in the law, evening and morning sacrifices, etc. So the connection to Genesis 1 is even more obvious if you continue with the passage in Genesis. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Just as I gave you green plants," Genesis 1, "I now give you everything," dominion over the rest of the creation, so to speak. "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply and fill the earth and increase upon it." You see the parallel blessing? That's the same blessing that God gave to man on the land in Genesis 1, and creatures of the sea, and birds of the air. The covenant line of Seth, the land, the earth, had been cleansed through the flood. Well, what comes next in the Noahic covenant? "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man." Now, what's going on here? I think that what's going on is Israel had been made in God's image. Israel is really representative of Adam. Adam and Israel are connected. God has handed judgment for murder over to His people. In other words, Noah's grown up from Adam. He's become more mature. But this condemnation here for murder is nothing new, because we know that murder is wrong based on the story of Cain and Abel all the way back in Genesis chapter 4. So what we have here with Noah's covenant is a reestablishment of the earth that God created in the beginning. The Noahic covenant reaffirms the original created order made in the beginning with Noah as a new man on the land. Now, if you follow me so far, then it means that this earth mentioned in Genesis chapter 8 and 9 was destroyed at the end. Isn't the Noahic covenant a part of the Old Covenant order? Did Noah's animal sacrifice atone for sin, specifically for the sin of Adam? Or did it foreshadow a better sacrifice? I submit to you that the Noahic covenant as a constituent element of the Old Covenant creation entirely passed away at the end. And so now consider this contrast between this covenant with Noah and what we find in the new heavens and the new earth. What does Revelation 22 say? "On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month." When Noah's earth passes away, there are no more seasons. The days and the seasons and the years set up on day 4 of the Old Covenant creation, renewed with Noah as a new man on the land, all come to an end. Unlike Noah's earth, the new heavens and new earth has no seasons or seed time and harvest, no cold nor heat, no summer and winter. How can there be summer and winter? Because there is no more sun nor moon or stars. What about the day and night mentioned in 8:22? Revelation says there is no more night, for the Lord God gives them light in Revelation 22:5. Noah's earth, as part of the Old Covenant creation, completely passed away with the entire Old Covenant creation in the first century, making room for the long-promised new heavens and new earth, wherein righteousness, the true righteousness of God, dwells. So what covenant creation tells us? If you follow these themes, land and sea, and I'm going to get a little more crazy in my next presentation in Truth Voice. What covenant creation tells us is that all of these stories are connected. The creation, the curse, and redemption all match in nature. So how you take the nature of the creation, biblically speaking, in the biblical story, you have to take the curse the same way. And you have to take the redemption the same way. That's the way Paul presents it. That's the way the New Testament writers present it. That's the way the story is presented. Even the national judgment in Noah's day by the flood finds its own covenant context within the wider story of the Old Covenant creation. And so the more we apply the principles of covenant eschatology to these old stories in Genesis, the more we're going to see these nuances come to the surface. The problem is that for generations, God's people have misunderstood the nature of the beginning and the nature of the curse as surely as we have misunderstood the nature of the end, the resurrection and the redemption of the creation. So when it comes to last things, preterists know that the issue is covenant, not biology. And so it's time to get biology off the brain regarding first things. It's all about covenant from beginning to end, and that's why I believe that covenant creation matched with covenant eschatology is going to completely rewrite Christian theology from the ground up. Thank you.